You're with your mum on a Saturday morning and you've taken the train into the city. You're wearing your good clothes because that's what you do when you go to Walton's. You push through the heavy glass doors on George Street and the smell hits you first, something between new fabric floor polish and the faint sweetness of the perfume counter near the entrance. The ceiling is high. The floors are gleaming. There are escalators, actual escalators. And for a kid from the suburbs in the 1960s, riding one is still a small thrill every single time. Every department has its own world. Manchester upstairs, white goods in the back, shoes on the lower ground, the toy section if you're lucky enough to get dragged through it. Your mum is at the fabric counter with a number ticket waiting her turn, and you're standing next to her pretending not to stare at the woman behind the counter who can measure and cut 6 meters of floral cotton without taking her eyes off you. At the end, if you've been good, there's the cafeteria on the top floor. A tray, a chicken roll, a glass of Cotty's raspberry. You sit by the window and you can see all of George Street below. That was Walton's. And if you grew up in any major Australian city between the 1950s and the mid-1980s, there's a good chance a version of that story belongs to you. Different city, same store, same smell, same escalator, same feeling that this was where families came when something mattered. So what happened to it? To origin and peak, one man, one menswear shop. The answer begins in 1951 with a man named John Robert Walton, Bert to anyone who knew him, standing in front of a 12-story menswear store on George Street, Sydney, that he just bought. The building was formerly Murdoch's. Bert Walton had grown up the son of a Queensland sharebroker, done a decade in business that he'd later describe as a failure, and finally found his footing running a credit-based furniture company called Cash Orders. He agreed to take over that company only on one condition, that they stop selling furniture and start building something bigger. In November 1953, the business relaunched under a new name, Walton's, 16 stores from day one, and Bert wasn't finished. In 1955, he came back from a business trip to the United States with a coup that stunned the Australian retail industry. He'd done a deal with Sears, Roebuck & Co., the largest retailer on earth, to merge with Walton's. It was the first partnership of its kind between an Australian and an American merchant at that scale. Sears's ability to bulk buy internationally at the lowest possible prices came straight to Walton's shelves. The store layouts, the fixtures, the visual merchandising, all of it redesigned along Sears's lines, under the guidance of Bert's wife Peggy, who ran Walton's entire store planning department and shaped what the chain looked and felt like for the next 30 years. On 22 October 1964, Walton's opened 12 stores across Melbourne in a single day. 12 stores. In one day. The Burke Street flagship alone cost over £3 million to build, had 53 separate departments, and was reported to be the city's first new department store in 40 years. The Lady Mayoress cut the ribbon. The crowd that came through the door was so large that office staff were pulled onto the selling floor just to keep up. The next day, Walton's took out full-page newspaper advertisements thanking customers for their patience. At its peak in the early 1970s, Walton's controlled around 96 stores nationwide and assets worth $170 million. In the fiscal year ending July 1973, the company posted record net profits of $8.4 million. This was not a niche retailer. This was one of the defining institutions of Australian suburban life. 3. Why it worked, what WALTONS actually gave people. To understand Walton's, you have to understand what shopping was like before it. In 1950s Australia, if your family needed a new refrigerator, a school uniform, curtain fabric, and a pair of work boots, you went to 4 different shops on 4 different streets. You planned it. You budgeted for it. You made a day of it because it was, by necessity, a day of it. Walton's collapsed that into one building, one trip, one roof, and it did so with a confidence and modernity that felt genuinely new. The Sears influence showed in the store design, wide aisles, clearly signed departments, logical flow. But what made Walton's distinctly Australian was the way it positioned itself, not just as a shop but as a destination, as somewhere you dressed up to go, as somewhere the whole family came. The cafeteria was not incidental to that. It was structural. You could spend 3 hours at Walton's and eat lunch without leaving the building. Children were managed. Husbands were fed. Mothers could browse the Manchester department without watching a clock. The cafeteria made the extended visit possible, and the extended visit was how Walton's made its money. The lay-by counter did something equally important. Walton's understood long before the word accessibility was used in retail that most Australian families in the 1960s could not pay for a washing machine or a bedroom suite outright. Lay-by meant you paid it off over weeks or months, and the item waited for you in the storeroom with your name on it. It was not credit in the American sense. There was no interest, no debt. You paid incrementally for something that was already yours in principle. For working families, this was not a convenience. It was the only way major purchases happened at all. And then there was the charge account. Walton's introduced its all-purpose charge account in the 1960s, a way for regular customers to shop and settle at the end of the month. This was aspirational. This was what respectable families did. Having a Walton's charge account meant you were the kind of household that was trusted by one of Australia's largest retailers. People were proud of it in the way people were once proud of things like that. For why it died three forces, none of them slow. Walton's didn't die because it stopped being good at what it did. It died because what it did stopped being enough. And three things brought that about in sequence, each one landing before the previous had fully registered. First, the discounters arrived. Through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, Kmart and Target, both American concepts adapted for the Australian market, began spreading through the suburbs. They had none of Walton's elegance and all of its product range, at prices Walton's simply could not match. They weren't on George Street or Burke Street. They were at the new shopping centers going up at the edge of every growing suburb, with car parks and no dress code and no escalators to impress anyone. They were built for a different Australia, an Australia that drove to the shops rather than trained in, that valued price over presentation, that had stopped dressing up on Saturdays. Walton's had been built for the city. The city was no longer where most Australians spent their Saturdays. Second, Bert Walton retired and his replacement was Alan Bond. In 1981, Bond Corporation acquired Walton's. Bert Walton, who had spent 30 years building the chain store by store, relationship by relationship, with Sears's backbone and Peggy's eye for detail, was gone. Bond was many things, but he was not a retailer. He was a deal maker, and he approached Walton's the way he approached everything, as an asset to be leveraged. Almost immediately, the flagship George Street store was demolished. Bond announced plans to build Australia's tallest skyscraper on the site, with a brand new Walton's at street level. It was the kind of announcement that sounds like vision and turns out to be noise. The building never went up. For years, one of the most prominent pieces of real estate in Sydney's CBD was a hole in the ground. It remained a hole in the ground for so long that Sydneysiders started calling it Bond's Hole. By 1983, Walton's Bond had posted losses of $199 million. $199 million. The Melbourne stores closed. The Victorian market was abandoned entirely. John Stewart Walton, Bert's son, who had served as chairman, resigned. The family was out. The name was hollowing out from within. Third, when Bond sold, he took everything that remained. In 1987, Bond offloaded Walton's trading assets to venture stores for somewhere between $120 and $125 million. $40.7 stores across New South Wales and Queensland changed hands. As part of the deal, Bond closed Walton's Employee Superannuation Fund. The people who had worked the charge account desks and the fabric counters and the cafeteria tills for 20 years found their retirement arrangements wound up without ceremony. The remaining stores were rebranded Venture and Norman Ross. The Waltons name disappeared from every shopfront in the country. By 1987, it was over. And when Venture itself went bankrupt in 1994, even the successor was gone. 5. What was actually lost? The Elegy. In Fortitude Valley in Brisbane, the old Waltons building on Brunswick Street still has the name screwed into the wall near the entrance. The signage is original. The letters are still there, slightly weathered, blacked-out door glass behind them. For decades after the store closed in 1987, the lower level was occupied by discount novelty shops. Now it is largely empty. The name remains because no one bothered to take it down, which is perhaps the most accurate monument to what happened to Waltons. Not demolished, not transformed, just slowly forgotten, with the original lettering still marking the spot. But here is what those letters actually stood for, and what deserves to be remembered alongside the balance sheets and the Bond Corporation losses. Waltons was where working Australian families bought the things that mattered, not luxuries, necessities dressed up with dignity, a school uniform on lay-by, a refrigerator paid off at $15 a fortnight, a winter coat selected carefully from the rack and carried home in a Waltons bag that you saved and reused. The transaction was never just commercial, it was relational. The woman behind the fabric counter who remembered what you'd bought last time. The lay-by ticket with your name on it in the storeroom, proof that the store was holding something for you. The cafeteria that made a trip to the city feel like an occasion rather than an errand. There was a social contract embedded in all of it. Waltons offered ordinary Australians access to a version of retail that felt considered and respectful, at prices that, for most of the chain's life, were honest. In return, those Australians came in on Saturdays and brought their children and their mothers and spent the afternoon. That contract held for over 30 years. It was broken not by the customers but by the people who bought the chain and stripped it for parts. The Kmart that replaced Waltons in many people's shopping habits is cheaper. The Meijer that occupies the space Waltons once anchored is more upmarket. Neither is quite what Waltons was, that specific middle register, neither discount nor luxury, where a family with average means could spend a Saturday and feel that the city was for them too. Waltons was perfectly suited to the Australia that existed between 1953 and 1980. An Australia that trained into the city centre, that saved for large purchases, that measured respectability partly by where and how it shopped. When that Australia shifted, when the car, the suburban shopping centre, the discount chain, and finally one reckless man with a corporation remade the retail landscape, nothing about Waltons could shift with it fast enough. There's a hole in the ground where the George Street flagship once stood. It was filled eventually. A Citibank tower sits on the site now with a retail arcade at the base. You'd walk right past it without knowing, which is, somehow, exactly right. Comment bait. If you remember Waltons, which city, which store, what did you go there for? What did it smell like walking through those doors? And does anyone remember the cafeteria? Leave it in the comments. These places deserve better than a hole in the ground and a Wikipedia entry.